Hello, old school comic book reviews. Okay, I've got here The Life of Captain Marvel. This is basically the early mid 70s stuff that was written and drawn by Jim Starlin, um, centered around Marvel Comics version of the Captain Marvel character, Marvel. If you're a superhero fan, you probably know a little bit about. Let's just jump back here. Um, there's the DC Comics version of Captain Marvel, and there's the Marvel Comics version of Captain Marvel. And off the top of my head, I think there's at least three, I think four different characters in the Marvel Comics universe, the Marvel Comics 616 universe, that's used the name Captain Marvel. And like I said, excuse me, there's the DC Comics version, which, excuse me, which is the original 40s Golden Age version. But if you notice, whenever DC does something with that version of the character and it comes out on the cover, it always says Shazam, or it says Shazam, the original Captain Marvel. And just to go back, just because I think this is kind of interesting in a kind of like, history of comics type of way, the reason for that is you go back to the 40s, that original character was actually published by a company called Fawcett Comics. And, it's the Billy Batson version. He says Shazam. He changes from a little boy into a, great big superhero and so on and so forth. And the character was really popular. The rumors were it actually started to overtake Superman a little bit. I do know for a fact, though, what happened is DC Comics, the people who own Superman, brought charges against Fawcett Comics saying this is copyright infringement, saying the Captain Marvel character is too similar to Superman. You're ripping off our character. And I don't know exactly what the judge ruling was, or even if there was a judge ruling is. I do know the end result ended up in Fawcett Comics going out of business, okay? So for years, for a couple of decades, there was no character out there called Captain Marvel. Cut to the 60s, Marvel Comics is taking off, Spider-Man is popular, the FF is popular, Incredible Hulk is popular, all these characters are popular, but Marvel is, really gaining, presence in the comic book industry and things like that, and they're starting to expand their line and whatnot. And at some point they decide they're going to come up with their character called Captain Marvel. And why not? They're Marvel Comics. Nobody else is using the name. Let's have our Captain Marvel. And in that version of the character, Marvel is an actual captain in the Kree militia. And the Kree is a race of, aliens from another galaxy and so on and so forth. And they've come to Earth, and they're basically kind of spying on Earthlings and so on and so forth because they eventually want to take over, and conquer the Earth. And what happens is, Marvel decides that he likes the Earth and he likes humans and he doesn't want to conquer anybody, and that's where the conflict comes in. Okay, they do that story for a while, and after a while they kind of wrap up that kind of storyline and they revamp the character a little bit. They change his costume around, and then they kind of switch the premise somewhat, and that's when they bring in Rick Jones. Rick Jones was previously friends with the Incredible Hulk, then he was friends with Captain America, and through a real kind of convoluted thing, Rick Jones gets these energy bands, or the nega bands is what they were called at that time, and he and Marvel sort of merge. And what happens is when Rick Jones is on Earth, Marvel is in the negative zone. He's floating around there, just on another plane of existence or whatever. And whenever Marvel is on Earth, Rick Jones is in the negative zone. But at the same time, they can always communicate. And the way they switch places is they have to bang the energy bands together. And there's a big ka-tang and la-di-da-di-da. Okay, so meanwhile, we're getting to the early mid-70s. DC Comics now has bought the rights to those old characters, so those old Fawcett characters, I should say. So they pick up Captain Marvel. I believe they pick up um, the characters who became the Freedom Fighters. That is the Uncle Sam, Phantom Lady, Human Bomb, Doll Man. I think it was a few other characters. I'm not 100% certain on that. If somebody's a little bit more educated on that, please let me know. And I want to say they picked up Plastic Man around the same time too. I'm not 100% certain on that, but I think that's how it went. Like I said, please let me know. Put it in the comments or whatever. But anyway, like I said, at this time, Marvel Comics has sold up like all the legal rights and the trademarks and things like that. So Marvel Comics can produce a comic book called Captain Marvel, but DC Comics, even though they own the rights to the character that predates this character, they cannot have a comic book that says Captain Marvel. So their comic book has to say Shazam. In a way, it's kind. Well, I was about to say it's kind of ironic, but I don't think I'm using that word right. But it is interesting, that here one company has the character that predates the other company, but they can't, use that as the title of their comic. On the other hand, you can look at it this way: had not DC, sued Fawcett Comics, Marvel Comics might not have been able to use that name to begin with. And for anybody who cares, I think the same thing just happened like Marvel Comics. Like a couple of years ago, they had a comic book with some new characters that came out called The Order. They really wanted to call the team the Champions, but that was the title of a company or title of a team that they had back in like the mid 70s, like around 76 or so. They haven't used that name since then. And they tried to come up with this new this new team, but they couldn't use the name because I think some gaming company or something like that is using a name now. So what comes around goes around, I guess. Whatever. Okay, so anyway, getting to these stories. Like I said, these are these Jim Starlin stories, and they're kind of they're pretty way out, but they're pretty interesting. What I have are the reprints. I have the individual reprints from the mid 80s. It's 5 issues that roughly contain Captain Marvel's, I believe, number 25 to about 34, plus Iron Man 55 and I think Marvel Feature 12. Now those two things, the Iron Man thing and the Marvel Feature thing, ripped off their main grill. The Iron Man thing and the Marvel Feature thing don't really have too much to do with Marvel, but they do feature like some of the earliest appearances of Thanos, which is why I'm sure is why they included it in with all this sort of stuff. The Marvel Feature thing is like a team up between a Thing and Iron Man, and like I said, the Iron Man story has like the very first appearance of Thanos, and it looks a little bit different. Like I said, what I had were these 5 individual issues that reprinted like those 12 comics. I believe there was a trade paperback that reprinted like all this stuff called The Life of Captain Marvel. Then they put out another trade paperback called The Life and Death of Captain Marvel, which had most of these stories plus the Marvel graphic novel where Marvel died. And I think those things might be out of print, but I think Marvel Comics has since put out another edition that has reprinted this stuff. Plus, I think there's like a Death of Captain Marvel like hardcover. I'm not sure if it's got all these stories in it, but it's got some essential stuff in there. For what it's worth, Marvel is one of the few superhero characters that's still dead. He's got Barry Allen beat. I think Barry Allen stayed dead for like about 20 20 years, 25 years, something like that. I think Marvel died in like 80, 81, 82, something like that. And he's still dead. I think if I were going to speculate on it, I think it's a few reasons, to tell you the truth. I think at first, for the first several years, he probably stayed dead just because the people who were down there at Marvel at that particular time probably just wanted to respect the story. And but I think now it's probably just a case of, well, there's already been whatever a few other people who've used the name, plus they have all these other characters that can do or do the similar things. You know what I mean? You've got you've got all these cosmic characters out there. You've got Quasar out there. You've got Captain Marvel's son. You've got Captain Marvel's daughter. You know, you've got all these other people who have, like I said, similar powers. The other people who've either got cosmic awareness or something similar to that. Beyond that, the guy kind of flew around. He blasted people. He had kind of moderate super strength. You know what I mean? So that's probably why that character is still dead. I mean, there's nothing really gained by bringing him. Okay, I apologize. I'm having some kind of issues here. I apologize for the bad editing. Okay, like I was starting to say, these stories are really interesting to me. They're interesting for a bunch of reasons. They're interesting, obviously, for the characters and the situations and the concepts and the crazy metaphysics and all that kind of stuff that's going on. Interesting, of course, for historical reasons about, when they came out and what they mean to like Marvel comics and superheroes and stuff like that. And just interesting just as far as like the cultural zeitgeist, the pop culture thing, what was going on in society at the same time that these comics were coming out. More or less the plot, if you will, has to do with Marvel and Rick Jones discovering, who Thanos is and what he's up to, and basically Thanos is going to destroy the galaxy or whatever in order to impress the spirit of death. And to do this, he has gotten a hold of the cosmic cube. Well, first he's got all these other guys that he's got working for him. Then you find out he's got the cosmic cube, and there's a crossover with the Avengers in here. Like I said, there are the other stories involving like Iron Man and the Thing, and Iron Man's got to fight some other thralls or henchmen of Thanos called the Blood Brothers, and like I said, there's the Thing Iron Man theme up, and just a bunch of crazy things going on. This collection also has the story where Marvel fights the villain Nitro, which I don't know if it's not really a spoiler. But does have that scene where Nitro steals some nerve gas. Marvel has to seal up the canister with his hand, which, gives him cancer, which he will die from. And a few years later, well, I was going to say a few years later in comic book time. It wouldn't have been a few years in comic book time. It was a few years later in real people time. But anyway, read and taken as a whole, it's kind of, some of the storytelling is pretty sloppy. You know what I mean? It's kind of tough to read these comics in one sitting. A lot of comics, even older comics. If there's a big story, read better at trade, or they read better if you read them in one sitting. This is the exact opposite, just because it's so episodic and there's so many different things that seem pretty random, and it's so crazy, and they are obviously just trying to there was a little bit of this kind of making it up as you go along kind of feel to it. It's better to read like a couple of issues or a couple of chapters one time, then put it down, go do something else, come back to it, and it works a little bit better in kind of like bite-sized morsels, if you will. But it's really interesting. Like I said, you have Marvel doing all kinds of, what do I want to say here? There's the whole thing if he's a cosmic hero. So you have Marvel meeting Eon. You've got the Thanos stuff, of course. You've got the stuff with the Titans. That is the Titans from the people who live on the moon of Saturn. That's what I mean. And the whole thing where Marvel gets cosmic awareness. There's actually a pretty funny thing here because when the stories start off, Marvel has gray hair. After he gets cosmic awareness, his hair turns blonde. Ha. Drax the Destroyer's in here. If you read like the modern Guardians of the Galaxy and you like that character, these are the earliest appearances of that character. Earliest appearances of Thanos. So if you like Thanos at all, definitely get this. And just lots of crazy stuff. Lots of metaphorical stuff going on. Or not metaphorical stuff, metaphysical things going on. And it's just really crazy and zany and really out there. I think there was a little bit of that. Like I said, it's the early mid 70s, so I think there was a little bit of that, you know. You introduce me to my mind. A little bit of that stuff going on. I'm not judging nobody. I'm not in a position to judge anybody. I'm just saying, I'm just saying. But it's pretty good. The art is kind of way out there. I think I mentioned in another tape that, Jim Starlin has gone on record, discussing about how he was a big, big fan of of Steve Ditko and Steve Ditko's Doctor Strange. So you see some of like the crazy landscapes and a way out, backgrounds and things like that. I'm sure, Jim was also probably influenced by some of the weird, underground comics that were probably coming out at the same time. You got to remember, once again, it's the 70s. People are like just coming out or just starting to come out of that whole weird psychedelic thing. And I'm sure that had a lot of influence on a lot of the, art and all the creators as well. Let's see here. Do you have you have, like I said, some of the very first appearances of Thanos. The Thanos looks a little bit different, see, a little bit skinnier. I know I've seen interviews where, and another thing, a lot of people bring in the whole thing, how Thanos is a little bit similar to like Darkseid over at DC Comics, and Jim Starlin these days freely admits it. He admits he was influenced by that, about psychology classes he was taking, how Thanos represents certain ideas about the id, and how we have Eros and Mentor, who are, Thanos' brother and father. They make an appearance in this series, and about how those guys were supposed to represent, the ego and the superego. I'm getting off track. I was going to say Thanos is a little bit skinnier the first time you see him, and supposedly Roy Thomas, who was the editor at Marvel Comics, came to Jim and said, this guy looks a little bit too much like Mentor from the New Gods. Bulk him up a little bit, and then he gradually grew into the the character that we know now. Okay, so anyway, to find these stories, like I said, I have the individual issues of the mid 70s or mid 80s reprints. Of course, they're way out of print, but I'm pretty sure if you look, you'll be able to find them at a local comic book shop. Not too expensive. That's, if you just want to read the stories for fun. Try to find the trade. I would recommend try to find either Life of Captain Marvel trade or the Life and Death of Captain Marvel trade. You might be able to find it cheap for whatever on Amazon or eBay or something like that. And like I said, I'm pretty sure Marvel Comics has since repackaged these stories, But that's it. Let me know if you think I left anything out about, old school Captain Marvel. Thanks a lot, and have a good one.